Happy Saturday, everyone. I am the dramatic historian, and today we have historian, author, and personal friend of mine, Louis Picone, on the show today. He is a presidential historian and has published several books from Grant's Tomb, The President is Dead, and Where the Presidents Were Born. We will be discussing his latest work, which is Ulysses Odyssey. I have to say right up front, this book probably ranks within my top 10 favorite books I've ever read.
Oh,
And
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
that is it's brilliantly written. The research is phenomenal. And it was so hard for me to put that book down at any given moment, because it almost felt like I was actually reading just a novel. I mean, it felt like so much of it just wasn't even real or possible, but it all happened. And you write it in a magnificent, just chronological order. I want to break everything down because I'm sure for
Mhm,
our listeners, when it comes to Ulysses S. Grant, they know him either as the guy on the $50 bill,
mhm,
they know him as a president, or they know him as a Civil War general. There's really not a whole lot of in between there.
yeah,
So, what I want you to do is I want you to break this down for me. We have a famous general and president who just served his country for really the past 15 years. And around the same time, you have the Odysseus from the book The Odyssey, who
mhm,
just took part in the siege of Troy for roughly 10 years. Okay. So there's a lot of reasons why Grant decides to go on this journey instead of just going home as Odysseus did.
mhm.
So the first question I have for you is, what are the political motivations for him to go on this trip around the world? And what were his own personal motivations to do this?
Really good question. And Nathan, thank you for having me on, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. So, political motivations for Grant, there really weren't many. This was what he had set out to. He always wanted to travel. All throughout his life, Grant loved to travel, and it was really interesting for me to chronicle his love of travel throughout his life. From a very young boy who wanted to see beyond his small Ohio hometown. So he always had this desire to see the world, and you can see that in his writings in the 1860s when he's saying that he'd love to go overseas, but he can't do now because of political reasons at home. So after serving in the Civil War and as secretary or as commanding general of the armies, briefly as secretary of war, in between, before he became president, he had been in the public eye from 1861 to 1877 until he left the presidency. And he always had this desire to travel, to go to Europe. Julia did as well. So just weeks after leaving the presidency, even though this was something that he'd been planning for years, him and Julia and their son Jesse set out to travel overseas. So I mentioned that there wasn't really any political reasons. He didn't have a political agenda when he was traveling. It was really more of a personal agenda. It turned into a personal and political trip, but that wasn't his intention from the onset. He just really wanted to travel as long as his money and as long as his wanderlust last. And one of his other major motivations was going to see his daughter who had moved to England. He wanted to go see his beloved Nellie. So that's how the genesis of the trip began of traveling. But as you mentioned, it turned into so much more as he was traveling.
Yeah, it seems that it almost again, circumstances, much like his circumstances in the war and then in his presidency,
Mhm.
it all changes. Everything has to change. He has to think quickly about, okay, what is he going to do next? But I think this is one of the few times he didn't mind doing that. You're right. As you mentioned, he loved traveling. So
Yeah.
him deciding, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to Asia sounds great.
Yeah.
um, so he does have a number of people though that join him on this journey, and he's going to meet many people. You already mentioned that he went to Great Britain to go see Nellie. Well, I think one of I would argue probably another key person in this whole story, I would argue is his wife, Julia.
Definitely.
And
Yeah, no argument there. Absolutely. They were, a really, uh, uh, wonderful couple. They complemented each other. They had this endearing love affair and this really touching friendship, and really complemented each other and were wonderful parents. And she acted as kind of a partner in diplomacy too throughout the journey. Since you brought up Julia, one of the things that I really enjoyed about researching and writing about Julia and Grant's trip, is the personal side of their relationship, and the personal side of Grant and the personal side of Julia. Kind of going back to Grant, in reading about his Civil War exploits and his presidency, uh, you don't get as much of Grant's personality and Grant's sense of humor that you do from researching and writing about his tour, when he's much more relaxed, when he's out of the public eye, and he's just really enjoying himself. And people that see him talk about how his personality has changed so much that it's almost like before the war, where he was much more relaxed because he'd been in the public eye for so long.
how do you think Julia's view of these countries, do you think she felt a lot of the same way about some of the institutions in these countries, the same way Grant thought about them? Do you think that they diverged in some places?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Julia brings a unique perspective to the tour, and one of the uh, one of the institutions that they both feel strongly against is slavery, because they encounter slavery when they go to Egypt, and they encounter colonialism in India and other Asian countries as well too. So Julia, I mean, they're both anti-slavery, but Julia kind of enjoys the attention when she's in Egypt, when she's at the palace, and there's these uh, servants slash slaves that are tending to her every need. She talks about how it's like the Arabian Nights, where she can just clap her hands, and these Nubian servants emerge from behind the curtains for every need. So she's kind of really enjoying that side, and almost has a little bit of a blind spot to the fact that these aren't voluntary paid servants. And even there's an instance where uh, there's servants who are tasked with running in front of their carriage, where they have these flowing white robes, and it's purely for an aesthetic, where it just apparently looks nice having these people run, and Grant really wants none of it. He sees it as inhumane, but Julia thinks it's lovely, thinks it's part of the culture. So there are instances where they diverge, but Julia is also in many ways as progressive as Grant is. She sees where there's instances where women are being treated like beasts of burden, and she's horrified by it. She speaks out against colonialism just as strongly as Grant does. But they have these unique personalities as well, too. These different personalities, so they bring different perspectives. One of the things about Julia that I really enjoyed, kind of adding to the narrative too. She has this very strong nationalism. No matter what she sees it. She enjoys every aspect of the trip, but she always sees everything as being inferior to America. No matter what, whether it's the food or whether it's the transportation, just in dialogue with queens and with leaders, heads of state, she can't help but compare everything to America. And with her, America is on a pedestal, and she just talks about it uh, so interestingly. Like at one point, someone asks her about what she thinks about America compared to the countries that she's visiting, and she points to the chandelier and she says, "That's like America. That chandelier, like kind of glowing from above over everything. That's America."
I found her story very courageous. I would describe her
Mm.
as almost brave and courageous for taking part,
Yeah,
just as much of an active part in this journey as granted. And one of
yeah,
my favorite parts that tell so well is actually towards the end of the book, where I believe it's in one of the western states, I think it was Colorado, they were going into a mine shaft. Grant didn't think that Julia would come down this mine shaft with them, but nope, she put on a hard hat and away she went. That story itself speaks a lot about her.
yeah.
But Julia isn't gonna be the only person, that will be with Grant on this journey.
Mm.
There are several others. In every new place they went, an old friend of Ulysses just kind of pops up. One that always shocked me is his one of the soldiers that served under him at the Battle of Shiloh. He pops up in Malaysia when he arrives, and it's
Yeah.
very strange that these 2 veterans of the Battle of Shiloh are meeting each other again in Malaysia. And I'm sure this was a very surreal moment for both of them. Could you just talk a little bit more about these people, whether it's this soldier in Malaysia or or simply explain why did so many people join him?
Hmm. Well, so as far as who joined Grant, so he set out with it was Grant, Julia, their son Jesse, and Julia's maid Bella, who's kind of like the silent participant that I wish would have written her memoirs, because she's with them the entire journey, and you can't find her voice at all. She's like this silent partner. So I would have loved it if she wrote memoirs. But that's it. So that's all who are on the ship, the Indiana that sails from Philadelphia to Liverpool. And so there's no Secret Service. There's no security, and there's no advisors, there's no speech writers. And part of it is that Grant just wants to, like I mentioned, there's no political agenda. He wants to travel like a common citizen. Now, everything kind of changes from the get go as soon as they pull up to Liverpool and they have this massive welcome and thousands of people lining the wharf. And so everything changes. He will have some people join him. One, he encourages his children to join him. Fred will take him up on it. His other son Buck will not, and Jesse will go home at some point. Nellie will join for legs of the journey. So he has his family. And then also, he really, when he meets Americans, which he does all throughout the tour, and I want to talk about that in a moment, he he has this he really enjoys spending time with Americans and traveling with Americans, because there's always expatriates or the ambassadors or consuls who will spend time with him, and he really enjoys that. And throughout his trip, he's writing his friends back home that it would be great if you can come join me. And his very short time Secretary of the Navy, Adolf Bory, will take him up on that, and he'll join him for the Asian leg of the journey. As well, there's a newspaper reporter, John Russell Young, who's reporting in London at the time, and he encounters Grant and he covers some of his stops in London. And then his newspaper, the New York Herald, assign Young to join Grant for the rest of the tour and cover it for the newspaper, as well as he turns it into a 2-volume book. So those are some of the long-term uh, travel partners of Grant. Everywhere he goes, there will be other people who join him, like the in Egypt, the consul, who's essentially the ambassador at the time, will join him throughout his journey, and then he'll write a book about it, Farman. And in many countries, there will be The ambassadors will join him, Americans as well as foreign leaders will join him, or sometimes assign someone to essentially be his escort throughout the journey. But as you mentioned, when he's traveling, he keeps encountering Americans too, and some of these are like these chance encounters. There's one point where he sees someone who he had spent time with in Oregon in the 1850s that boards his ship, and they have this incredible reunion. Part of the attraction, or part of the interest in these reunions that makes it so fascinating when studying it, is Grant's memory. He has an incredible memory for faces, for places, for dates. So when he has this chance encounter, I think if someone surprised me that I hadn't seen in 25 years, I'd kind of be struggling for points to connect. But Grant can jump right into it and get right into specifics, and it just makes for these great encounters with the Civil War uh, veterans that he sees. It's just there's kind of like so many different facets to Grant's tour. One of them is the person, is Grant himself. The other one is the time when he travels. So it's it's a dozen years after the Civil War, and many of these Civil War veterans have gone on this sort of global diaspora themselves. During the Civil War, a lot of American soldiers before the Civil War really hadn't left their hometown. And during the Civil War, all of a sudden they're seeing the country, and many of them decide that they want to keep traveling, they want to see the world, as well as others decide that they don't want to leave the military, so they look to overseas to kind of leverage their military experience. So there's one really interesting encounter when Grant goes to Egypt. And at this time, there's about 50 veterans, both Union and Confederate, who have become advisors to the Egyptian military. So he gets off a train and he sees two of these soldiers, one Union, Stone, and the other one, William Loring, from the Confederate Army. And both of them had kind of had personal reasons for looking to start over again, falling out with the Confederates. Stone had lost at Ball's Bluff and gotten court-martialed after that. But Grant, part of it is he's seeing his old Civil War veterans. He's seeing uh, one for the Union, one for Confederate. The other side is that Grant has this deep-seated feeling of reconciliation and reunification, and that the war is over and we're all Americans again. And so John Russell Young is seeing this reunion, and he's just writing about it as three old friends who just can't stop reminiscing, and they're in the back of the train, or they're sitting over to the side, and Grant is just relishing in this reunion. And these sort of encounters happen all throughout the journey, whether he's meeting American expatriates, but so many Civil War veterans all throughout the journey. And when he comes back to America, and he starts speaking before Union veterans, Confederate veterans, Union and Confederate veterans together, he tells them, everywhere I traveled, I met some of you all throughout the world.
One thing I didn't consider was the possibility, and you mentioned this, that veterans, they when they left their hometown to go serve, they visited places they had never seen before, and that
Mhm.
prompted them to go travel. I'd never thought about that because I'm sure the soldier from Iowa, I'm sure he was amazed when he got to Savannah and was like, "Wow, this is really different." I didn't think about that. I think that's, an astute observation, but not everyone that Grant saw, he was always extremely excited to see. And I've been waiting to ask you this question about, Adam Badeau particularly,
Mhm.
uh, because Adam Badeau, he actually pops up pretty early on in the trip,
Mhm. Yep.
and For those of you that don't know Adam Badeau, he actually is going to famously publish the military history of Ulysses S. Grant, which is this 3-volume military history series about all of his campaigns.
Mhm.
It's very popular. Grant even says himself before he writes his memoirs that this is the closest thing of what I did.
Yep, and
And
Grant reviewed, most of the book before it went to press.
yeah,
Mm,
uh,
well
it's a very good series. It's very, very detailed.
mhm,
But his feelings towards Bordeaux was a totally different situation. If you would like to just kind of explain the conflict that Grant actually has is with Bordeaux early on and explain how that reflects um, kind of his relationship with him as well as the journey itself.
yeah. So Boudreaux, or Adam Boudreaux is at the time, he's a consul in London. So Grant is writing him back and forth as he's planning his trip, that he's looking forward to seeing him. Much of the relationship of Boudreaux and Grant is colored by events that happened at the end of Grant's life when uh uh when Boudreaux was helping Grant write his memoirs, and there was a conflict because uh Boudreaux felt that he was uh that Grant's memoirs were going to step on his book, they were going to overshadow his book, and so they ended up having this falling out towards the end of his life. So much, and both of them are writing about, or not so much Grant. Boudreaux is writing about the events of their world tour as well after that falling out with Grant, as well as Julia is doing the same thing. Grant really doesn't write about the tour. In his memoirs, he doesn't get past the Civil War because he didn't live long enough. But Julia writes extensively about the world tour. So that episode is a really fascinating, or that relationship is really fascinating to write about because it's so colored by events that happened years later. When Julia's writing her memoirs, that's after Grant had died, and Boudreaux is writing about it as well after their falling out. So I wouldn't say that Grant didn't like Buddo, but and Grant kind of had that famous loyalty to people, and he was a little bit blinded by their faults. And I think that Adam Boudreaux kind of falls into that category as well. Boudreaux kind of leeches onto the trip, and he volunteers to serve as Grant's aide de camp, using kind of the old Civil War position, and Grant really doesn't want anything to do with it. He's like, this isn't the Civil War. I don't need an aide de camp. Julia doesn't want much to do with it either, feels he's going to kind of almost be a third wheel on the trip. Boudreaux is pretty insistent about it. Now, to Badeau's defense, I think Grant really benefited from having someone kind of serve that role of, we're going to be traveling to traveling to London, so let's make sure you get arrangements and stuff like that. But it did really cause some conflicts throughout the trip, where Boudreaux kind of uh, thought a lot of himself and really kind of made himself the center of attention, particularly when they stayed overnight with the Queen. There's uh, a contemporary who hears that Boudreaux has kind of attached himself to this journey, and writes about, oh, that's a pity that that Boudreaux is going to be going with Grant. So Boudreaux kind of like comes in and out of the picture throughout much of the European tour, but he won't continue on to Asia.
Do you think Badeau maybe picked up on some of that? Do you think it's possible that maybe not even the trip, but just their falling out towards the end of their life? Do you think that maybe colored the way a little bit he ended up writing about the trip with Grant?
Yeah, I suspect so. I suspect because he writes about it extremely defensively.
Well,
Uh,
and the
so
reason
I
why
do
I ask
suspect that.
that is because it sounds like there's also some other instances where people do write their own accounts of meeting Grant in different
Mhm.
countries. Well,
Yeah.
there's one account specifically in India that I found very interesting,
Mhm. Enlighten.
where it talks about how Grant vomits on a dancer because he's so intoxicated, and it just kind of goes back
Mhm.
to that whole drinking nonsense. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about just even some of the research or the accounts that you read and how you were able to kind of sift through that and figure out, okay, what was actually accurate and what wasn't.
Mhm. Yeah, so Grant, the one thing throughout his trip, which he travels for, uh, well over 2 years, circumnavigates the globe. After that, he pauses for, like, 3 weeks, then he travels south. So it's almost 3 years that he's taking this international journey. There's almost no unpleasant incidents throughout this trip. When he goes to Calcutta, he meets with Lord Lytton, who was an American poet, and he kind of rebranded himself, and he was now serving in India with Great Britain. He was a Confederate sympathizer, and he was also known for stretching the truth or just writing uh, kind of fantasy type of tales. So when uh, Grant visits Calcutta, he writes about how I mean, it's really I don't it's almost like, whether your audience is PG or R rated, what he
Oh,
writes about.
it's fine.
I don't know.
It's fine.
I don't know what you're rated on
No, it's
Spotify,
history.
but,
It's
uh,
fine.
yeah, it's extremely lurid what he writes about. It's really it's revolting that, uh, Grant copulates with Julia in front of everyone, and then he vomits all over the place, and then he's drunk. It's, like, so over the top.
Well, and it
Uh,
doesn't even sound like the general.
yeah, doesn't sound like the general at all. Anyone else who was there, no one writes about anything like this. So it's really kind of disregarded as just this twisted mind of Lord Lytton. And there's plenty of precedent for that in his writings as well. As far as Grant's drinking, what I so Grant has this incident when he's serving in the West way back in the 1850s, where he reportedly had been drinking to excess, and he ends up leaving the military under dubious circumstances. And there's a good chance he was drinking when he was in the West. There's all these different hardships that he was enduring at that time, but uh, this label of a drunk kind of dogs him throughout his life. And it seems like every Civil War loss, someone wants to say that Grant was drunk, and uh, it also kind of takes on this afterlife too, with the whole lost cause mythology that persists. There's a movie that uh, uh, I forget it's I think it's an Abraham Lincoln movie by D.W. Griffith, and who also did Birth of a Nation. And there's this scene with Grant and Lincoln sitting at the table, and there's like this bottle of liquor where Grant is just like salivating over it. And finally Lincoln was like pushes it towards him, and he just starts like he's in the desert dying of thirst. So this reputation of Grant as a drunk dogs him throughout his life by his critics, and in his afterlife because of the lost cause mythology. Most recently, Ron Chernow, in his excellent book Grant, kind of labels Grant, or doesn't label him. He calls him a functioning alcoholic and uses all of this evidence from his research. So I don't go so far as saying that Chernow was wrong, but from studying his world tour, what I found is all throughout the world tour, Grant is drinking socially. When he goes to the Hofbrauhaus in Munich, which is this old brewery that's still there, this historic brewery, he meets with the consul, and the consul is kind of acting like a tour guide. And he's like, "Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to a museum? Do you want to go to see some factories?" And Grant's like, "Well, I've kind of done that." And then the consul is like, "How about we go to the Hofbrauhaus?" And Grant's like, "That sounds good." And he sits down at the bar and he has a beer, and he has just one. The consul asks him for a second. He says, "No, that's enough." And but all throughout the journey, Grant is toasting champagne and he's drinking wine. He meets an old friend in Frankfurt, and he has what his friend from Frankfurt says, that they sample 28 different types of wine. And he meets with a German leader, and he insists that they toast schnapps to Germany's and America's enduring friendship. So all throughout the journey, Grant is drinking socially, except for this one grossly over the top incident in Calcutta that is so uncharacteristic in so many different ways. And again, Lord Lytton has this whole reputation for fiction, kind of discounted. But so all throughout this journey, he's drinking. So what I propose in my book, what I counter chair now, is that absent the pressures of office, but including his family. Because while he's with his family, because if when he's stationed on the West Coast, he's not with his family. He doesn't have his children. There's another son that he hasn't even met that was born after he left. He hasn't seen Julia in over 2 years. So with his family and absent the pressures of office, he's able to drink socially, and there's really no indication that Grant was an alcoholic or had any alcohol problems during this world tour.
Grant would he liked to travel as just a common citizen. He didn't expect these huge crowds, but one of uh, the same thing, it was so repetitive. Every new place he went, I just always expected huge crowd of people.
Yeah,
Everyone was just waiting to meet him. They just wanted to see him. However, it, European political leaders had a very difficult time addressing Grant. They
yeah,
didn't understand how to address a former president.
yeah.
This also complicated matters elsewhere as well. But how did it complicate the overall nature of his trip, especially when he's in Great Britain?
Yeah. Yeah, because Great Britain, the Queen Victoria is the one that really has the most problems. And in her defense, she's the first person that has to deal with it because there's all this protocol in England, and all of these world leaders have this protocol for how to treat other world leaders. But Grant is no longer a world leader. He's a former president, and now he's just a common citizen. So Queen Victoria really doesn't know how to welcome Grant, and what she decides to do is kind of escape to her Scottish castle and kind of wait it out, hoping that Grant will just pass through England and she doesn't need to deal with it. And but meanwhile, again, yeah, like you said, Grant wants to travel just like a common citizen, but everywhere he goes, there's crowds that are greeting him, and everything starts in England. So when his ship pulls up in Liverpool, there's thousands and thousands of people lining the shores. There's ships that are decked with American flags. There's the town mayor, the alderman, the town constable. They're all coming out to meet him. And everywhere he goes through England, the crowds continue to get bigger and bigger. In Newcastle upon Tyne, it hits its apex with 150,000 people cramming the streets to see Grant. And I kind of joke about it, but not so much joking, that England wouldn't see crowds like this until the Beatles 100 years later. And when I write about the accounts and when I read the accounts of Grant's receptions, it's not that much different from the Beatles of people screaming in euphoria and charging the stage and creating these dangerous situations. So all throughout Grant's journey, he's being greeted by local leaders, and he's getting the freedom of the city and the freedom of the burg, all of these ancient honors, which are kind of like similar to the key of the city in America. So Queen Victoria sees all this. She's trying to wait it out. She realizes that she needs to somehow address this, that this really doesn't look right. England and America have this or have been allies for so long. And so as Grant is preparing to leave, she sends him this last minute invitation to come stay overnight at Windsor Castle. And what what she does is end up kind of setting the precedent too for the rest of the countries, for rest of the empires, for how to greet Grant. And uh, so this is the age of the telegraph and the age of the railroad. So communications are happening much faster at this time. The print media with newspapers. So every every destination is seeing how other places have treated them, and they're kind of upping their game throughout the journey. The other way that England kind of struggles all throughout the journey, because this is during the era where the sun never sets on the British Empire, is is the 21 gun salute. Whether Grant should get a 21 gun salute or not, which is kind of the ultimate honor to give him. And England determines that Grant shouldn't get the 21 gun salute, kind of treat him as an honored citizen, but not the 21 gun salute. And sometimes there'll be English captains that defy orders and they give the 21 gun salute anyway. But this becomes like this ongoing point of controversy all throughout the journey. And so finally, towards the end of his journey, when he goes to China, China gives him a 21 gun salute, which is the first time ever in Chinese history that they've ever given anyone a 21 gun salute. They say even the emperor only gets a 3 gun salute because that's tradition there. So yeah, it's interesting throughout the journey how these destination countries are navigating how to deal with Grant as his worldwide celebrity keeps growing and growing throughout this trip.
Was there any country that did not greet him with the same amount of enthusiasm? W if that's the case, what do you think it says about the institution within that country, or countries for that matter?
There really wasn't any countries that didn't greet him with enthusiasm. There was, uh, depending on the local government structure, there might have been like in when he goes to Germany, there's not so much of like the press pool around him because they really don't have a free press in Germany at the time. So there's some of those different dynamics that he's dealing with. But what's fascinating, all throughout the journey, he's getting this hero's welcome wherever he goes. The only uh, minor incident from that, which is really more amusing, that happens at the time, when he goes to Ireland, which becomes his last stop of his European trip, because when he first comes to America, his ship stopped in Irish waters for just several hours, and Grant didn't get off the ship, but he promised that I'll be back. So when he's preparing to leave Europe after over a year and a half there, he decides I've got to go to Ireland. So he goes up there. Some leaders in Ireland have this belief that Grant is anti-Catholic, even though he's met with the Pope, even though he's welcomed Catholic chaplains into the Union Army, and he's never doesn't have anything on record against Catholicism. Uh, it kind of goes back to Iowa when he makes this statement about the separation of church and state that some Catholic leaders in Ireland kind of take the wrong way. But there's one county in Ireland, County Cork, that decides that we are not going to invite Grant here. Grant is uninvited, even though Grant was never going to Cork on his trip. But what's interesting for Grant, he's like, I don't know why they think I'm anti-Catholic, but all throughout his trip in Ireland, he's having the time of his life. He is the most relaxed. He's giving the longest speeches that he does all throughout the trip. He's joking. He's kind of poking fun at leaders as he's doing in remarks. So all throughout Ireland, he's given this tremendous warm welcome all throughout the journey. He goes from Dublin up to Northern Ireland, the Belfast and Londonderry, and he gets this tremendous welcome all throughout the trip.
Now, again, another one of my favorite moments in the book was there was a weird moment where there was talk about making Grant the king of Bulgaria. Could you tell us how this rumor even came about?
Yeah, that's that was really fascinating because I'd read nothing about that before. And that kind of came, like, pretty late into my research too, where
I
I stumbled onto these references of King of Bulgaria. I'm like, "This is absolutely wonderful." I've g and so Bulgaria had just recently formed. There was when right after Grant, or even while Grant is sailing there, sailing to Europe, a war erupts between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, uh, the Russo Turkish War. And out of that war, these new nations are formed, including Bulgaria. So there's a rumor that begins that Grant has been offered the to be the king of Bulgaria. And it kind of there's like this brief frenzy in American press about Grant being offered the kingship of Bulgaria. And then someone interviews one of Grant's friends back in America, George Childs, and he admits to starting the rumor. But what is interesting to tie into this rumor is this other facet of the tour is that when Grant leaves office in 1877, if there were popularity polls at the time, his popularity would have been pretty low because there's the scandals, but even more so than the scandals, which is usually what historians will focus on. There's uh he's getting criticism from the Democratic Party, from the party of the South, of the former Confederates, as well as many in the Republican Party, for what today we would call federal overreach, for using the full power of the military and the judiciary to prosecute the Ku Klux Klan in the South and protect Black Americans in the South. He's being bold enough to send the federal military into states in the South because state leaders aren't doing anything about riots and massacres that are happening against Black Americans in the South. So that's where most of the criticism for Grant comes during his presidency, and you can see that in the primary sources more so than the scandals. But regardless, there are the scandals as well too. So when he leaves office, his popularity is relatively low than throughout the other years of his presidency.
When you actually mentioned this King of Bulgaria thing, I actually took the time. I actually went into, like, Chat GPT, and I just
Mhm.
simply said, "Create an image showing what Ulysses S. Grant would look like as King of Bulgaria." And
Mhm.
really, there's no difference. They put a crown on him, but he just looked angry.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't have been happy being the king of Bulgaria.
Probably not.
Yeah,
I wanted to see what that would look like, but it
yeah.
was a very humorous image.
So there's this other facet of Grant's tour. While he's traveling and Americans are seeing this adulation that he's receiving all throughout the globe, there becomes like this national reconsideration of Grant. And almost as soon as he sets sails, there's talk of Grant running again in 1880 for a third term, and this uh, increases throughout the tour, and then eventually you start seeing in the newspapers what becomes known as the Grant boom, where there's this movement, this third term movement. So that's what's interesting to play off this third term movement, and eventually he will allow his name to be submitted in the 1880 Republican convention. So, kind of playing off this third term movement against the King of Bulgaria rumor is really interesting. It's almost like Americans now have competition for Grant.
Well, I want to continue with that same line of thinking here because his Grant's stock is clearly going to increase with the public as
Yep.
he makes his way around Europe. Well, it comes to a point where he visits Egypt, he visits Constantinople, which very, very interesting parts of his journey, but
Mhm.
he ultimately decides actually to head over to Asia as well. How does this decision actually help his image back home politically.
Yeah. Uh, his supporters are telling him throughout his journey that Elihu Washburn being one of them are telling him, "Don't come back too soon," because, in fact, come back as close to the convention as possible because because your stock is rising so fast here. We want it to be at an apex when you come home so you can kind of like ride that wave right into the presidency. And Grant, all throughout his journey, and what's really great about, or just one thing that's really that I find really interesting and is really admirable about Grant is how the public grant and the private grant are so similar. What he's saying in public is what he's saying in his private letters too, and what he's saying to his children, that he doesn't want to run for president again. He doesn't want this for his family. He's already served his years. Let someone younger become president. That there's other people more skilled than him at president. So he doesn't want to run again. And but you can also see where it's not quite that black and white because there are times where he's considering it. These letters are coming in for him to delay his journey, and then a couple days later he'll write some friends and say, now I think I'm going to be coming back in May, or maybe it's going to be June. So he's kind of also considering it at some level as well too. So it's not quite as black and white. Many historians will say that he wanted to run again, that he couldn't wait to get back to the White House. Others will say that he absolutely did not want to run again. But you can kind of see that there's subtlety there. There's nuance there where he does consider it.
Do you
What
think
ultimately persuades him is when he goes south and he sees the treatment of black Americans and sees how this bitter sectionalism still exists between North and South. And he understands that the best hope for black Americans are with another Grant presidency. And I think that's when he ultimately decides to allow his name to be thrown into contention again.
do you think he just was genuinely conflicted about serving again? Because it almost seems to be that there's if that's what he's writing, I can't imagine Grant being someone that's gonna have certain undertones or try and manipulate public opinion about him.
Mhm. I don't th well, I'm very confident he didn't wanna run again. He
Okay.
never when he left office in 1877, he never imagined that he'd run again. And remember, no one had ever done this before.
Right.
There's no Grover Cleveland at this time. There's no one that who left office and decided to come back again. So, this is truly unprecedented, as well as a third term is unprecedented. George Washington set the standard in his first 2 terms to not run for a third, and really, no one felt bold enough to defy George Washington, so no one had tried to run again, no one had really seriously considered running again for a third term before. So, I know when he left office in 1877, he thought that he was done. I think this Grant boom that was growing louder and louder in America, hearing from his supporters, but also you can see from his writings that besides other political issues that are going on at the time, there's the labor movement that's happening at the time with the railroad strikes. He still has this concern over reconciliation between North and South and this deep concern for Black Americans in the South. When he's overseas and he reads about the railroad strike and how everyone is so supportive of sending in the military to put down the strike, he said, "Isn't it interesting when I used the military to put down riots in the South that everyone was against me? Now they're all supportive of it." And so he still has this deep commitment to Black Americans in the South. And you can see how every president after Grant, every Republican president after Grant, really every president, but they're mostly Republicans besides Cleveland, cares less and less about Black Americans in the South, and they're more willing to submit to the status quo. And so Grant really is had Grant won again, had Grant become president again, you can really see history of Jim Crow laws and other aspects of American history going on a different trajectory. So it really was there really was a lot at stake had Grant decided to run again. And I'm kind of going off in a different topic there.
No, it's okay. I will say though, it even though there's this question of, is Grant gonna run again? Is
Mhm.
he going to go be president again for a 3rd term?
Yeah.
He is going to get involved. Well, he doesn't, again, want to get involved, but he's
Mhm.
thrown into this problem when he visits China. While he's in
Oh.
China, you mentioned, once again, it was a great trip for him. He does
Mhm.
get I believe it was a 21 gun salute when he gets there. They
Yep.
do treat him like a like a world
Yeah.
leader.
Yeah, and the
Um,
crowds grow to 500,000 in Shanghai that come out to greet him.
yes,
Mhm.
but while he's there, one of the Chinese generals that was there mentions the dispute they're currently having with Japan over the
Mhm.
I'm going to butcher this name,
The
uh,
Ryukyu Islands,
the
yeah.
Ryukyu Islands.
They called Luchu at the time, which is much easier.
Okay, the Luchu Islands.
Ryukyu.
Let's call it that. The
Yeah.
Luchu Islands, and they personally asked Grant to go speak with the Japanese on this matter.
Mm,
How does Grant go about resolving this matter between China and Japan, and how does it ultimately get resolved?
mm. So Grant, throughout his journey, there's this as he's kind of being pushed into political situations and making speeches before all levels of public gatherings to hundreds and thousands of people to small political gatherings to almost like taking Q&A. He has this constant theme of almost global peace that there's one point he's talking about, wouldn't it be great if we had a global institution that could resolve disputes similar to like our Supreme Court. And there's a precedent for this because during Grant's presidency he establishes the principle of international arbitration through the Alabama claims with Great Britain. So he's got this reputation already for peaceful resolutions instead of what was kind of the popular way to resolve disputes at the time was going to war. So Grant, this great warrior, his campaign slogan was "Let us have peace." But when he starts to travel the world, that "Let us have peace" takes on more global meaning. When he goes to Asian countries and he's encountering imperialism and he's encountering colonialism, he's advising countries on how to maintain their independence. And when he goes to and how to use their natural resources and how to avoid crippling debt. And so he's got this very progressive attitude and not just a Eurocentric attitude, which kind of would have been what would have been expected for Western leaders at the time. But so when he goes to China, he's got this reputation already that had been built up after a couple of years of traveling and giving these remarks for his sense of integrity and his sense of fairness. So when he goes to China, the general or the viceroy Li Hongchang, and then he meets with the Prince Kung. He doesn't meet with the emperor because the emperor is only 7 years old, and he sees no point of meeting with the so-called last emperor. Uh, so they ask him. They're having this dispute with China over this disputed island chains, and there's all this historical backstory to this. And they're on the precipice of war, and Japan is a much more powerful uh, uh, nation than China is at the time. So they ask Grant, when you go to Japan, can you help negotiate peace between us? And Grant says, I'm just a common citizen. I have no, uh, 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 I hold no office. I have no official position, but if there's anything that I can do to further peace, then I would gladly do my best. But he's also very pragmatic too. He says, I know when I go to Japan, they're going to have a whole different story than you do. And so when he goes there, he meets with the emperor. He's given this incredible welcome as well too, and this is the last stop of his journey. So in some ways, Japan gives him the greatest welcome at all throughout his 2.5 months there. He meets with the emperor, and he ends up going on a peace summit in this mountain town of Nikko, and he meets with the emperor's cabinet and leaders, and he convinces them that, or he tells them that war isn't going to benefit anybody except European powers, that it's in your best interest to avoid going to war with China. One, they're a much weaker power than you, so you can easily dominate them in a war. But who's going to benefit are going to be European powers that are going to sell you munitions. They're going to try to get their military leaders over here as advisors. They're going to put you in debt, and they're going to kind of get their tentacles in you. And that's who's going to benefit, because Europe kind of has this historical precedence of doing that. And so they take his advice. They avoid going to war. There'll be a conflict about 15 years in the future. But so this becomes kind of the crowning achievement, the crowning diplomatic achievement that's coming at the tail end of Grant's international leg of his tour. And it just really shows the amount of respect that uh, that these world leaders had for Grant, and the amount of integrity that he had, and commitment to world peace, to a reduction of international conflict.
Well, talk about foresight. You mentioned that Grant already foresaw that the Pacific was going to become this
Yeah,
great, really theater of economic domination and a point of interest for the United States.
yeah.
And he saw that when he visited China, he saw that when he visited Japan. And it's fascinating that you have Emperor Meiji, who was going to completely restructure Japanese society
Mhm,
into what really we understand it as today, which is this very modern industrialized country.
mhm.
But as they're working on the Constitution, he's referencing what Grant is telling him. He's talking about how it's so important not to be in debt to foreign nations. Again, it blew my mind just how much intelligence and wisdom Grant
Yeah,
possessed when he was there.
yeah.
And that really speaks volumes in your book. And as we get toward the end of his journey, you already mentioned this. This is the end of the international part of the journey. The
Yeah.
part that I never even considered was the fact that when he gets home, he is still traveling.
Yeah.
This is what is crazy to me. I would be exhausted. I would say, let's go home. Nope. He says, let's keep going. So when Grant actually returned home, how did the people of the United States receive him? And also, how did he feel about going? He eventually does reach Galena, Illinois on his
Mhm.
way to Philadelphia.
Yeah,
How
he
does he
avoids it
actually
as long
feel
as
about it
possible.
at this point?
Yeah, he avoids Galena as long as possible.
Yes.
And no knock on anyone from Galena, but that's the only home that he owns, and he really hadn't spent any time there. The citizens of Galena gave him this home. He had spent time there really at a very low point of his life when he couldn't support his family, so his father took him in to work in his leather store. But you're right, when he reaches America, when he sails into San Francisco, he's he's given this unprecedented welcome, and that's something that struck me all throughout the journey. When he reaches San Francisco, when he arrives in Philadelphia, when he goes to Chicago, when he goes to Greece, when he goes to China, Japan, and England, all throughout the journey, there's uh, this repeated these words are repeated in a very similar fashion over and over, that nothing like this has ever happened before in history. This reception that Grant is getting, the way that cultural barriers are being broke down just for Grant, like the 21 gun salute, and there's dozens of others sort of similar incidents that happen all throughout the journey. Nothing like this has ever happened before in history. That happens when he reaches San Francisco, where hundreds of thousands of people are there waiting for him, and there's no wireless communication at this point. So they're up on Telegraph Hill, and they're up in the highlands kind of looking to wait for those masts coming over, or the steam uh the ships kind of coming over the horizon to welcome him. And when he gets to Philadelphia, 350,000 people are there to greet him with this massive celebration, this massive procession marching through the streets. And again, it's written like nothing like this has ever happened before in this city. And this is the most historic city in the country. And so he gets to Philadelphia. He goes round the world in 944 days, as opposed to Phileas Fogg does it in 80 days. And you're right. He still has the travel bug. He still wants to keep traveling. And this also speaks to his powers of persuasion too, because Julia is the one that kind of is getting frustrated sometimes throughout the trip, where she wants to go home. She wants to see her namesake granddaughter that she hadn't seen now in 2 or 3 years, wants to see her other son Buck that they hadn't seen. So the fact that Grant is able to convince her, let's keep traveling. Let's go south now. And he goes to the former Confederate states. He goes to Cuba, where he is kind of the grand marshal in the Carnival parade. And like he's almost like Forrest Gump, how he finds himself in these different situations.
Yep. No.
And then he goes to Mexico, and then back through the Confederate states, and then finally comes back to Galena, where he settles in. But he doesn't even stay there for long. I mean, it's kind of like getting to the end of the book, but this book was so difficult to find an endpoint for, because even after he comes home and after the trip is over, he still keeps traveling. He goes out west, and he just never kind of stays put.
No, even when he's home, he does it all. He travels to the southern states. You mentioned he goes to Cuba, and then when he's in Mexico, he shows Julia where he saved her brother in the
Yeah.
Mexican-American War, and I just I can't even imagine if you're Julia and he's just showing you all this, like, this is
Yes.
just something that's very normal. This was just, you know you're right. It's a very much a Forrest Gump situation.
Yeah.
But as we start to wrap up here, there's just a few
Mhm.
questions I have left here for you.
Mhm.
The first one is, was there a story that really stuck out to you when you embarked upon researching for material for this book? And then what do you think that says about Grant? And finally, what is the major lesson you want the reader to pull from this book?
Mhm. So let me see. The first question, what surprised me, maybe
Yes.
coming out of the trip.
Yes.
Uh, One thing that motivated me to write this book is I'd done so much research, and I've kind of gotten so deep in Grant and writing Grant's too. One thing that struck me, and I won't name the author, there was a writer from a book in the 1990s that mentioned Grant's world tour, and he said, disparagingly, he said, "What did Grant learn from traveling the world for 3 years? What did he learn from the old world?" And then he answered himself, "Not much." And then he just kind of moved on to the next topic, and that's what stuck in my head. That how can this man who's so consequential, Civil War general, twice president, and this phenomenal end of life story when he's bankrupt and he has cancer and he writes his memoirs. How can this 3-year journey, how can not much come out of it? And it just, from my perspective, it just seemed like this fascinating episode. And someone, I mean, like I love to travel too. So there was kind of like that was one of the appeals. has just kind of fallen through the cracks in Grant's history. And so that motivated me to find out more about this trip. And the further that I got into finding out about the trip, the more I realized that there is so much here. Like I mentioned, all throughout the journey, nothing like this has ever happened before in history. So I think that kind of uh general idea that this was such an historic tour, that this wasn't just a pleasure jaunt, that this is something that everywhere he went, he was breaking down barriers. He was making history wherever he went. And but meanwhile, there's also this love of adventure that he has too, this other element, because he still just wants to travel despite all of this diplomacy and meeting with world leaders. He wants to visit the pyramids. His uh uh boat gets grounded in a river in Bangkok and he's stuck for 24 hours on Easter Sunday in a typhoon. So there's all of these different aspects to it that just fascinated me. And it just every leg of the journey has these different just different remarkable aspects to it. And I'd say one other thing that came out of it too is is paralleling the journey with this third term movement. And then when he visits the South, this still strong commitment to Black Americans in the South that prompts him to run again.
The last question I had is,
So
what is the message that you want the reader to take away from your work?
yeah. One is about Grant himself, what uh a couple different aspects. One, I think he has this truly adventurous life that is underrated. I kind of think of him as a Teddy Roosevelt without the bombast, and
That's
kind
actually a
of
great
like
way that's a great way to put it.
yeah, like much quieter because Roosevelt had all of these great adventures too, but he
Yeah.
wrote about them and he bragged about them. Grant was much more quiet. The other thing that comes out of this journey is just what an incredibly decent person that Grant is. And I one thing that I found that was really uh so admirable about him, and one as an historian, you don't want to kind of like fall in love with your subjects too much, and but just writing from a non-biased perspective. This is 1870s at a time when casual racism is accepted in social circles and vitriolic racism is kind of tolerated. Grant has this all throughout his journey. He goes to Africa when he sails 600 miles of the Nile River. He goes all throughout Asia. He's in India, he's in China, Japan. He spends a day in Vietnam. He's in Hong Kong. He's in pretty much every Asian nation. Never once does Grant mention skin color as a defining characteristic, which is meanwhile his contemporaries, John Russell Young, you can find some some very disturbing racism in there. When you read Mark Twain, who John Russell Young kind of tries to emulate, uh, you can also find some racism in there, but Grant has none of that. Again, very progressive attitude.
Well, again, we are here with Louis Picone, author of Ulysses Odyssey. You can pick up a copy on Amazon or check out Savis Beatty to order it there. Seriously, go get it. The writing is brilliant and you won't regret it. Louis, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nathan. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was great speaking with you.
Well, remember, if you need a fix for history, go check out History Fix, where you can stream all my interviews and much, much more. Go subscribe now, where you can do a 10-day free trial. Thanks for tuning in, and go enjoy your Saturday.